أطع أمرنا نرفع لأجلك حجبنا.
The last point, and the most interesting point in terms of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is actually understanding the intent of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We'll finish off with this point, which actually for me is one of the most interesting points about the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is that to understand the Sunnah properly and each piece of information we have from the Prophet ﷺ properly, is actually interesting to take a step back first and think, in what capacity was the Prophet ﷺ actually speaking when he was saying something? So you know in your own life you have different roles, different capacities within which you face the public or private sphere. You have a man who may be a husband, a son, maybe a lawyer by training, maybe an engineer, maybe a politician, maybe a bus driver. So you have all these different roles the same person will play. So when they speak with their children, they will speak as a father, and there'll be a different way of speaking when you do that. When you speak with your wife or your husband, there'll be a different way of speaking. So you will take that into account when you look at what the person is saying. If the person's in the public sphere and they're a judge, you'd actually look at how the person is speaking while they've got the wig on. You know, in the British legal system, you have to have a specific type of clothing. That would be important to know that this person, Ahmed, for example, is now speaking, but he's in a court of law. Now, the fact that people speak differently in different situations is not just normal people, but it's also related that the Prophet also used to speak in a different way depending on how he was in terms of his capacity. Ibn Ashur, rahmatullah alayhi, great scholar of the last century who wrote on the purpose of Islamic law, very famous scholar, also has one of the most fantastic tafsirs of the last century as well. He mentioned something interesting about understanding the hidden intent of Sharia. You know, if you want to know what makes a Sharia tick and what the purpose of the Sharia is, he says one of the most pertinent qualities of one seeking to fathom al-maqasid al-Sharia, which is actually the higher intent of the Sharia or the law, is to be able to distinguish between the varying intents of the words and actions of the Prophet ﷺ. This point that I've just mentioned in the previous explanation is exactly what he's talking about. If you want to understand what makes the Sharia tick, what makes you understand why the law is saying something and what's law there to preserve, one of the most important things he says is to actually look at the Prophet ﷺ and in what capacity and intent he is speaking and saying something. And he actually mentions a number of different categories. And nowadays we sometimes talk about hats, people wearing a hat. It's a very famous book about different types of hats. He says the Prophet can actually speak as a messenger from God. And that's an example of the Prophet ﷺ telling people, "Ittat as-sama wa hukka an ta'it." The Prophet said that the heavens are creaking, like wood creaks, wa hukka an ta'it, and it has complete right to creak because there's no space larger than 4 fingers span except there's an angel worshipping God or sajidan lillahi ta'ala, that's prostrating for Allah. That's the Prophet as a prophet who's showing you about the unseen, the hidden realm. So the Prophet there is actually speaking about things that are hidden from us, and we take it on face value as being something that God has revealed and inspired in the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet also works as a judge. In other words, he will now sit and 2 people will come to him. One is the plaintiff, one's the defendant. They're arguing amongst each other about a specific issue. The Prophet here will judge between them. And what he says here, to properly understand it, you will have to remember that the Prophet is speaking as a judge. And that will be slightly different from the Prophet speaking as a messenger. You'll also have a situation where the Prophet is actually giving general advice on a specific point of law, but in general. So a person comes to the Prophet and says, for example, in the previous hadith we looked at, that people asked him about travelling by sea and using seawater to perform wudu. At that point, the Prophet actually is giving an answer to a legal question in a general sense. He's not sitting in a court of law. He's giving general advice. So anybody in that same situation would be able to take that advice as well. And last but not least is leadership. The Prophet as a qa'id, as a leader of an army or a leader of a state or leader of a community. When the Prophet migrated to Medina al-Munawwara, he was the head of a state. He was the head of the Jewish tribes. He was the head of the Muslims of Ansar and Aus and Khazraj. He was the head of the people that came from Mecca al-Mukarramah to Medina al-Munawwara. In other words, he represented the state to other people outside the state. So the Byzantians would look at the Prophet as being a leader, and they would interact with him based on that. The Copts would likewise look at that as being the case. The Persians as well, when they interacted with the Prophet ﷺ and he sent them a letter and they ripped it up, the Prophet prayed that may their empire be ripped up, and it was within a decade. The point is, all of these are specific qualities the Prophet had, and they were different roles the Prophet played. The interesting thing for us is actually to think, okay, how do we know? You've mentioned that the Prophet had different roles, but how do we know which role is which? Because at no point in a book of hadith will it say, note, the Prophet here is speaking as a messenger. Note, the Prophet here is speaking as a judge. Note, that the Prophet here is speaking as a mufti. It will not say that at all. So what the question that we'll have to answer is, you've said that it's important to understand the intent of the Sunnah through knowing how the Prophet spoke and what capacity he spoke in. How do we know that? There's a couple of pointers that actually help you differentiate. And based upon that, when we look at an example, it'll become clear how beneficial this is.
أطع أمرنا نرفع لأجلك حجبنا